During the heady peak of the Soviet Union, Russia was among the most powerful nations on the planet. Untold thousands of units of equipment were built, all in preparation for a war with the US that never came. Little did the Soviet warmongers of the past know that their descendants will be using the equipment they built decades after its sell-by date. But that's what Russia is doing, and it's paying the price. Russia has been forced to deploy rotting Soviet armor as its reserves are depleted. Why? Ukraine obliterated everything else. Nowhere is this more apparent than with Russia's tanks and armored fighting vehicles. On January 24th, David Axe, writing for Euromaidan Press, made the remarkable claim that Russia has managed to replace all of its lost armored vehicle units. Once. But those replacements came from the rotting reserves Russia had dating back to the Soviet era. Now those reserves are gone. Burned through just like so much of the armor that Russia sent into Ukraine. And with weaker armor now at the front, it's only a matter of time until Russia is left with the thin air that now sits above the tarmac of its storage facilities as potential replacements for the armor that Ukraine is going to destroy. It all seemed to start so well for Russia. When Putin launched his so-called special military operation, Russia had the numbers advantage all across the board. On the infantry fighting vehicle or IFV and armored personnel carrier or APC fronts, Russia entered Ukraine with 13,842 of these types of vehicles combined. That should have been more than enough for Russia to run roughshod over Ukraine, especially if the Kremlin's assumption that Ukraine would respond to the Russian invasion with a strategy that suited Russia's attritional style of warfare held true. That assumption was a miscalculation. Ukraine responded with an asymmetric strategy that is making it harder for Russia to even use its armor, as you'll learn a little later in the video. But during the first few years of the war, Putin was all in on the Russian strategy. Send enormous numbers of tanks, IFVs and APCs, and Ukraine's defenses will eventually crumble. Instead, what we now see happening is that Russia's armor stockpile has gone up in smoke, and it's no longer in a position where it can send in replacements for whatever Ukraine takes out next. The numbers make for terrible reading for Russia, even if you only look at the numbers of confirmed tank and armored vehicle losses. Those numbers come from Oryx, which runs a live tracker of Russia's military losses that only accounts for the weapons that Russia loses that can be proven using photographic or video evidence made available to open-source intelligence communities. Even with this self-imposed limitation, Oryx records that Russia has lost 4,308 of its tanks, along with 8,735 of its AFVs and IFVs. For those keeping track at home, almost 9,000 AFVs and IFVs lost amount to about 2/3 of the entire fleet of those types of vehicles that Russia sent into Ukraine for Putin's initial invasion. And these are just confirmed losses. Oryx's numbers alone will be enough to make Putin weep. But if you listen to Ukraine, Russia has lost far more tanks and vehicles, which also implies that it had burned through even more of the armor stockpiles that we're about to cover. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says that Russia's tank losses stand at 11,605 as of January 25th. As for armored vehicles of all types, the ministry says that Russia has lost 23,950 of them. These are huge numbers, no matter which resource you believe. Even if the real numbers lie somewhere in the middle of these two sets of figures, nothing really changes for Russia. The reality that Putin must now face is that the stockpiles of already rusty and Soviet-era armor that he's been sending into Ukraine have run dry, and Russia's production numbers aren't anywhere near high enough to make up for the shortfall. Czech military analyst Jakub Janovsky made that point in an X post, where he said that Russia's IFV and APC fleet is now in most regards approximately comparable or slightly larger to what the Russian military had operational at the start of the 2022 invasion. While that may sound like good news on the surface, this is only the case for Russia because it has depleted its reserves to keep the IFV and APC numbers up. Annual confirmed losses now sit at around 2,400, Euromaidan Press says, and production runs at about 900 IFVs and APCs annually. That leaves a 1,500 vehicle gap, and again, this is using Oryx's numbers rather than Ukraine's, which Russia needs to fill using stockpiles of Soviet armor that it just doesn't have anymore. Axe breaks down the numbers even further. He says that Russia is currently building its new BMP-3 tracked IFVs and its BTR-82 wheeled APCs at a rate of around 400 to 500 each per year. At best, that gives Russia 1,000 new IFVs and APCs annually, though the number is probably closer to 900. As for what the Ukraine war has cost Russia regarding these vehicles, Russia has confirmed losses of 3,600 of its 1960s and 1970s era BMP-1 and BMP-2 IFVs. 2,150 of the country's MTLB tracked APCs, also from the 70s, have been destroyed. Russia's more modern vehicles aren't faring any better either. Ukraine has taken out 1,900 of the BTR-82s we just mentioned, along with 890 of Russia's BMP-3s. Even the airborne IFV named the BMD isn't safe, as Ukraine has inflicted confirmed losses of 700 on the Russian military. Where this gets really bad for Russia is when we look at its remaining stockpiles. There's a key word that we're going to use here: usable. According to Axe, Russia's stockpiles of usable Soviet-era BMP-1s and BMP-2s sat at around 4,900 in 2022. Now it has 1,110 units of these vehicles left in storage. The numbers for MTLBs are just as bad, as Russia has gone from having 3,600 of these vehicles to 530. There are no BTR-82s left in storage, from a previous high of 1,400, meaning that all BTR-82s entering Ukraine now come fresh off a production line that isn't keeping up. Russia also only has 120 out of the 460 BMDs that it started the Ukraine invasion with. Now, there's a reason why we made a point of the word usable earlier. It's very true that Russia actually has thousands more IFVs and APCs in storage than these numbers state. However, the vast majority of these rotting Soviet vehicle carcasses that it has are in such terrible states of disrepair that the best thing that Russia can do is mine them for parts to replace the ever-dwindling numbers of vehicles it has that might be usable. These rotting stockpiles aren't fixable at a reasonable cost, at least. It's better to pour the money that could be spent on fixing these useless vehicles into building new ones, and we've already seen the limitations Russia has in that department. Here's what it all adds up to. Russia now has 1,800 usable IFVs and APCs in storage, and it's likely that many of those will need to be repaired to some degree. On top of that, it's building around 900 vehicles annually. Bear in mind that the 1,800 vehicles are a one-time resource. Once they're gone, they're gone. Russia has lost between 2,250 and 5,980 armored vehicles each year that the Ukraine war has raged, depending on whether you use the figures from Oryx or Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. You don't need to be a mathematical genius to see that none of this adds up. Even if Russia pulls everything that it has in storage right now, it has about a year's worth of IFVs and APCs left before it can no longer replace what it's losing. That's when the number of these types of vehicles in Ukraine will really start coming down, which will impact how much territory Russia is able to take in Ukraine. But we'll come back to that soon. First, all of these issues we're seeing with Russia's IFVs and APCs are also present with its tank stockpiles. We shared the Oryx and Ministry of Finance figures for Russia's tank losses earlier: 4,308 confirmed by Oryx and 11,605 claimed by Ukraine. By October 2025, the New Voice of Ukraine was reporting that Russia has exhausted its available stockpiles of tanks, though it still had 3,000 hulls that could theoretically be restored. Still, that's a pretty small number, especially if Ukraine is right about Russia's tank losses. Again, it's about a year's worth of supply of what are likely old Soviet tanks that are easy prey for Ukraine's drones. And according to Axe, the number of usable tanks in storage may actually be as low as 1,030. On the production front, Defense Express said in November that Russia is building about 250 of its modern T-90Ms per year, along with 150 T-80 BVMs, which is hardly anywhere near enough to make up for all of its losses. No matter where you look, Russia's armor is collapsing. In about a year, it won't have anything left in its stockpiles, meaning it will have to rely on production facilities that aren't even coming close to keeping pace with the sheer scale of IPV, APC, and tank losses Russia is experiencing in Ukraine. And this is exactly the kind of thing we cover at the Military Show. There's plenty more where underreported statistics like these came from too. So if you're getting value from the Military Show and you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe. Now, a few minutes ago we mentioned something that we talk about later in the video. Namely that even if Russia were to somehow magically replenish its depleted stockpiles of Soviet-era armor or bump up its production numbers to the tune of several thousand per year, it likely wouldn't mean all that much on the progress front. The reason for that is very simple. Having IPVs, APCs, and tanks doesn't mean a whole lot when Ukraine's asymmetric warfare tactics are making it almost impossible for Russia to use them as intended. Axe makes this point in his article for Euromaidan Press, stating, "Having vehicles on paper doesn't mean Russia can use them. Ukrainian mines, drones, and artillery make mechanized advances practically suicidal." He has a point. Russia's soldiers have grown increasingly distrustful of the armor that the Kremlin provides to them, assuming they receive any of that armor at all. United 24 Media made that point in a June article, where it stated that many of Russia's armored vehicles focus on firepower ahead of protection for the soldiers contained within. It brings up the example of the BMP-3 IFV that we discussed earlier. That IFV has a 100mm main cannon and a 30mm main gun, both of which can be formidable weapons if the Russian soldiers driving the vehicle are able to get within range of Ukraine's troops, but often it can't. Its armor is just too thin to withstand blasts from Ukraine's mines and especially its first-person view or FPV drones. The same goes for many of Russia's other armored vehicles. BMP-2 has side and rear armor that can be penetrated by using heavy machine guns, and frontal armor that's just 16 millimeters thick. That's well less than an inch, and size matters when a kamikaze drone is bearing down on you. BTR-80 is even worse, as its side armor is just 7 millimeters thick and can be penetrated by a heavy machine gun from a range of 500 meters or around 1,640 feet. Imagine that you're a Russian soldier. Your commander tells you and some of your comrades to load yourselves into one of these vehicles to take on a Ukrainian position. Only you're miles away from that position, and you know that there is a massive kill zone filled with mines, drones, and perhaps even Ukrainian units waiting in ambush at specially created choke points. Are you going to risk driving through a kill zone in a so-called armored vehicle that can be shredded like paper by almost anything stronger than a standard rifle? Of course not. You'd probably prefer to go on foot, and you're going to find out soon why that doesn't work either. We just touched on the damage that Ukraine's FPV drones can do, and they have become the biggest barrier to Russia using what few armored vehicles and tanks it has left in any appreciable manner. We only need a handful of incidents from the last couple of days to illustrate. On January 25th, UKR-Inform reported that Ukraine's unmanned systems forces had destroyed 2 tanks and 29 vehicles in just 24 hours. On the same date, Defense Express shared a video of Ukraine's FPV drones hunting down and constantly bombarding a Russian turtle tank until it was destroyed. These aren't special types of tanks, by the way. Turtle tanks are Russia's way of trying to deal with the problem of most of its tanks coming from the Soviet era. T-62s and T-72s are wrapped up in makeshift modifications, often welded armor shells, that make them heavier and harder to drive in exchange for some scant protection against drones. It mostly doesn't work. Ukraine just has to send a few more FPV drones to take out one of these tanks. Desperation has become Russia's only form of defense, and we see that in the armor alternatives that it's fielding in Ukraine. As Axe points out, last year Russian regiments effectively parked their armor most of the time and instead attacked on foot, motorcycles, or even horseback. Lighter, smaller modes of transport stand a better chance of evading overhead surveillance. Of course, a better chance of evasion doesn't mean a 100% chance. Far from it. Russia's horseback rides may be trying to channel the spirits of their medieval ancestors, but that doesn't mean much when Ukraine's drones find them and bear down. Russia is trying to hide this particularly desperate tactic behind a mask of bravado and reverence for the brave, and certainly not terrified to the point that they're happy that they're wearing brown pants, soldiers who are dying on their horses. On January 7th, Forbes even reported that Russian media had tried to praise the so-called inventiveness of the soldiers attempting attacks on Ukraine's defenses while on horseback. That's one way to create an alternative version of the real story, which is that Russia's rotting armor is so useless that its soldiers may now have a better chance of succeeding by riding into battle on a horse. The fact that these cavalry charges are so often destroyed may not mean much to Putin. He and the Kremlin may even be happy about it. At least a dead soldier riding on a horse hasn't wasted one of the armored vehicles that Russia can't afford to lose anymore. Horses hardly offer a viable alternative to armor. And that brings us to another major problem that Russia has, and one we mentioned earlier. Real breakthroughs against Ukraine's defenses aren't possible without the armored vehicles and tanks that Russia has burned through. And by real breakthroughs, we mean any that happen at anything more than a snail's pace without incurring the losses of tens of thousands of Russia's soldiers in the process. Axe puts it well when he says, "Armored vehicles remain the best method of rapidly exploiting a breach in enemy defenses. That Russia can't deploy them for their intended purpose means that, barring a total collapse in Ukraine's defenses, the Kremlin has no way of breaking through." Russia has instead switched to attacking Ukraine's defenses with small units of infantry, including many soldiers attempting to advance on foot, for tiny gains of only a kilometer or so at a time. Assuming there are any gains at all, the predictable outcome is that Russia is churning through soldiers at an enormous rate. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, highlighted this in its December 31st assessment of Russia's campaign in Ukraine. According to the ISW, Russia managed to capture just 5,304 square kilometers, or about 3,295 square miles, of territory in 2025. And even that number is misleading, as 473 square kilometers, or around 293 square miles, is accounted for by territory that Russia took back from Ukraine in Kursk, rather than territory it captured in Ukraine by itself. In return for this territory, Russia suffered 416,570 casualties. That amounts to 78 casualties for every square kilometer gained in Ukraine and Kursk, which is where the real problem lies for the Kremlin. Russia has simply swapped losing armor for losing soldiers. Both are finite resources. In its own December 30th report, Mediazona points out that Russia's 2025 was even worse than it first appears. As Russia claims that it has a military on the rise and that it will soon overwhelm Ukraine, Its army is made up of increasingly older volunteers who are being sent into war to serve as little more than cannon fodder for Ukraine's defenses. Russia has officially switched to a strategy of saving vehicles and spending men, Mediazona reports, which is only further evidence that its stockpiles are as low as Axe claims. As for the aging men claim, Mediazona's data, which only covers Russia's losses confirmed via obituaries and official casualty reports, suggests that the average age of Russian casualties is trending toward 50, with the most frequent age of death recorded in 2025 being between 46 and 52. It seems that sending middle-aged men to do the job that armored vehicles and tanks can't do isn't working out too well for Putin. Russia has at least recognized this fact. According to Forbes, Russia has been experimenting with new tank tactics that it believes stand a better chance of achieving success than the tactics used before. Now, Russia is pairing 2 tanks with a small fleet of drones. The drones buzz around, coordinating fire and providing the tanks with greater spatial awareness, all as the tanks continuously switch positions so they can lay down fire without becoming stationary targets. Of course, Russia hasn't solved the problem of dealing with the fact that